When we have underlying insecurities about our own relationship with food or anxiety around how to feed our children, we adopt a whole host of different habits. These together form our parent feeding approaches. Usually there's not ill will in why we're doing what we do. Instead, I do believe that most parents want to feed their children well and that children do want to eat well. But somewhere along the way, we begin to test out different feeding techniques that seem to offset the insecurities and anxieties we face when we feed. Such feeding approaches are most commonly grouped together in the literature as the four that I've shown here: authoritarian, permissive, neglectful, and authoritative. In case it isn't obvious from the animation, this feeding approach tends to be considered the most strict of the four that we're going to be talking about. As parents, we can be tempted to believe that this food parenting approach will lead to the best outcome if we're measuring in terms of food being eaten, at least in the short term. But what we actually see is that that is not the case in the long term. With this approach, parents often feel in charge of, or rather responsible for, how much a child eats or if they don't. Parents can tend to show little regard for if their child is saying or showing that they're hungry, they're full, or they simply have underlying anxieties such as those we talked about before as underlying motivators for why they are not interested in eating the food that's being offered. Oftentimes this parent with this food parenting approach tends to try and control a situation by enforcing what we often know as a clean plate club, and will use tactics such as rewards, restrictions, bribes, pressure, or prompts in order to get their child to eat a pre-prescribed amount that they as the parent have set in their head is the proper amount for their child to eat at a given meal. While in the short term, this can be reassuring for parents because they see that their child actually did consume a given amount of food at any given meal, what we see in the literature and throughout research is that long term, this actually leads to children who tend to have poorer appetite regulation and are less likely to eat, or rather you could see this as prefer, fruits and vegetables long term as they grow into adults. Additionally, children who are raised with this food parenting approach tend to have more issues being overweight or obese later in life based off of the ways that they were taught to regulate as children. So we can kind of think through, if they were never given the ability to self-regulate and to tune into those intrinsic cues of hunger or fullness and where society fell in that, they're later in life less able to sense and be self-aware of what those traits are when it comes to regulating their appetite and overall intake as adults. Permissive food parenting tends to be the most lenient of the four approaches that we're going to talk about. Unlike authoritarian food parenting, where a child might say, "I'm done," and the parent's typical response would be something like, "You're not done. You need to have X number of bites before you finish the meal," or "You have to eat this before you can have dessert." A permissive parent would be more inclined to cater to their child in order to get their child to eat. An example from Ellen Satter in her book, The Child of Mine, she says, "Making an alternative food so readily available tells your child louder than words can say, 'I don't expect you to learn to eat your meals.'" And this can be an important quote for us to remember as we think of the different feeding styles and what messages it sends to our kids. With permissive food parenting, we see more short order cooking upon request. We see parents making separate meals for a given child, or oftentimes for each child in the family, or we see a lot of endless grazing and a lack of structure and boundaries around when and where food is available. This is because rather than reinforcing the healthy boundaries within the feeding relationship as parents often act out of a place of fear, and they assume that if we cater to our kids' requests, that it might make things better. For many of you that are in the academy, you know that this tends to not be the case long term. Initially, it may seem to us as parents that this seems to help our child have less tantrums or seemingly fight fewer food battles. What we know and what we see again and again in the literature is that long term, a permissive food parenting approach and children who are raised with this food parenting approach tend to not develop an appropriate sense of hunger and fullness due to the endless nature of their grazing. Since they're not trained to have a sense of appetite regulation that can work within more boundaries around meals and snacks, a child can not only not understand hunger and fullness the same way, but they also may be more out of touch with what a balanced diet looks like. For many children, if they graze, they tend to graze on a certain type of food, or a lot of the carboholic type kids, as parents often call them, will be children whose parents might fall under this food parenting approach. And when children are not given structure around meals to help with the appetite regulation, and they're not given the boundaries around what's available when and where, the diet also begins to get thrown off. Long term, we can begin to see how a child raised with this food parenting approach would be the one that's most likely to have a high intake of sweets or other high fat foods. Or, as many of us as adults realize, these are the foods that you don't necessarily have to have an appetite in order to be interested in eating them. As kids, we can often think that this is harmless and ultimately not shaping negative lifelong habits. What we see with this food parenting approach is that kids raised with this can later on have more health-related concerns related to this kind of diet due to the nutrient-poor but energy-rich diet that it is. The third food parenting approach that we're going to talk about is that called neglectful food parenting. And this isn't neglect in the negative, more natural way of using the word in terms of neglecting our child of actually feeding them, but rather this approach is often used by busy parents when food is just a very low priority. Parents who use this feeding approach might be those who just kind of fly by the seat of their pants or opt to just wing it when it comes to pretty much all things food, whether it's making sure that there's groceries consistently in the home or structuring reliable meals and snacks for their kids. Parents who use a neglectful food parenting style tend to place a pretty low priority on food in comparison to all the other pressures that they're facing in the day-to-day life. Having no routine and excessive flexibility in a parent's food parenting approach can unfortunately backfire. All of us are overworked and overwhelmed and often overstretched within our own lives, and yet when we don't have food in its proper place in terms of how important it needs to be for our family, what we can see happen is that our child often will lack nutrition and the development of healthy habits from an early age. With this food parenting approach, often kids might be exposed to more fast food because it's convenient and it's not something that requires preparation or proper planning or grocery shopping or any of those types of preemptive steps to get a meal prepared. And so understandably, they're going to have a less nutrient dense diet and also likely be exposed to less variety, especially if they have more preferential eating habits. They might eat the same thing at a given restaurant or to-go opportunity time after time. Long term, this can create other challenges because a child may be preoccupied with food because they're uncertain if and when such food might be offered, and fixate on food because there is an element of insecurity or a lack of trust with when and how food is made available. Oftentimes we can see parents who maybe don't stress as much or plan as much about meal prep or meal planning or things like that, and see it as a luxury that they're more flexible and things like that, and maybe are creating a more carefree or easygoing temperament in our kids using this type of food parenting approach. But what the research shows us is that when kids are consistently raised with this degree and level of inconsistency around food, that tends not to be the case. It tends to result in more preoccupation around food because of those uncertainties and insecurities around when it will be provided. In reviewing each of these mainstream food parenting methods, you might have recognized yourself some of the feeding behaviors that appear most similar to the ones that you and your family have adopted thus far. You might have noticed some of the offhand methods that you've tried in attempts just to survive a certain season, and you might also recognize some of those that are a bit more uptight or seeking of control. Either way, my point in bringing these up is not to induce any shame or guilt or speak judgment over you or what your family has chosen to do up until this point. Instead, I really want to just help us identify where we have maybe given it our best effort, but also seen that we are still unsuccessful in the food parenting approaches that we've tried out. As parents who have joined the Academy, I know that each one of you is highly invested in helping your child to have a healthy relationship with food. And whether this has been a long time struggle for your family or is a journey that you're just newly committed to, It is important that each of us honor the fact that I know we are all trying the best that we can. I know that each of you wants to help your child eat well, and I know that each of your children also want to do a good job in eating. And so the point that we really need to get to in addressing all of these different attitudes, anxieties, and approaches that we've covered thus far is how do we best get there? So let's quickly take a look to just put all of this together of what we've talked about so far. We've talked about the different anxieties and insecurities that we have and how that shapes some of the offhand approaches and attitudes that we have in the feeding relationship. I'm not going to go through each of these specifically, but you can take a quick glance to just see some of the different offhand approaches we might use with each of the food parenting styles. Some things like pressuring our child to eat, short order cooking, restricting our child from having more of a love it food in order to try and manipulate them to eat more of a learning it food, or just avoiding dealing with the problem at all and being a little bit more neglectful just at the expense of not spending energy that then comes back met with resistance or a meal that gets uneaten anyways. And if you look at these and maybe some of these offhand approaches that may be most applicable or seen in your family, you can also begin to see where these intentional attitude shifts and new approaches come in. And that's ultimately where we want to get at today. I want you to identify what anxieties you have underlying and how these have been shaping your approaches up until now. Again, there's no guilt or shame in this. You all have been doing the best that you can. But my goal for you is to help you understand how some of these underlying anxieties for you as the parent, or where your child's own anxieties come in, shape the approaches that you have been using, and how we can find a better way of approaching these. A more evidence-based best practice that will help you not be in the position that you find yourself in right now, but rather one that's less stressful and more successful in a feeding sense. The gold standard we're looking at is this here. And while mealtimes with young kids is always chaotic, even when you have an adventurous, willing eater at the table, it is something that we can get to being at a place where we're not even mad entering into a meal. And that's what I really want to focus the rest of this week's lessons on, is talking about the authoritative food parenting approach, or that best known as the division of responsibility. The authoritative food parenting approach sounds similar in names to the authoritarian food parenting approach we talked about in the first food parenting slides that featured the beast's reaction to just eat. You can tell here with the princess, it's a much different approach, and the tone and attitude going into meals and around the entire family's food environment is much different. With the division of responsibility, there's a few ways that we commonly hear this come up, whether it be with pediatric dietitians, feeding therapists, or especially throughout the research. The division of responsibility is the evidence-based best practice, but you can see here a few other ways that it's commonly referred to. With a parent who uses the authoritative food parenting approach, you see that their attitude is responsive to the child, and it shows structure and boundaries around meal times, and it shows respect for a child's job in choosing if, whether, and how much they eat. A parent who feeds with this approach encourages the child's food choices and fosters them to help learn to like new foods over time without forcing it at any given meal. With the division of responsibility, the key tenets to this approach are trust, control, discipline, and permission. And you can see throughout this quote shared by Ellen Satter, who's the creator of the division of responsibility and who has spearheaded tremendous amounts of research on the subject, you can see how leadership and autonomy come in. Again, tracing back to some of the anxieties we talked about before, parents often struggle and feel anxious towards where their leadership is, as do children with where their autonomy lies. So I want to go ahead and share this quote with you for a little bit better understanding on what this looks like. The division of responsibility in feeding boils down to both taking leadership and giving autonomy. You as the parent take leadership when you maintain structure of meals and snacks, you choose the family food, and you teach your child how to behave at the table. You give your child autonomy when you let your child decide what and how much to eat of the food that you have put before them. Leadership and autonomy with feeding are in direct parallel with the basic principles of eating competence, discipline and permission. The discipline is taking leadership for you as the parent. The permission is giving autonomy to your child. The difference, of course, is that for your child, you provide the discipline. For yourself, you play both roles. So while I did add a little bit of my own context to that quote to hopefully help you better understand what exactly Ellen Satter is trying to communicate here with what the division of responsibility is, hopefully you can begin to delineate how this is a food parenting approach that is more structured, but not necessarily as strict as some of the other ones that we've already talked about. So when we evaluate the pros and cons of the division of responsibility and why a parent would even look to feed their child this way, it really comes down to one overarching key factor of why we want to promote the division of responsibility from infancy, ideally, onward into adulthood for children. And that's for the development of eating competence in our child. When a parent uses a division of responsibility to provide one meal for the entire family, a child learns to like and to eat from what is offered, and therein and of itself, it creates less mealtime conflict. While this does require a little bit more upfront time, effort, and meal planning from the parent in order to implement such a meal, what we see is when used day after day, week after week, year after year, we begin to build eating competence in our child. Even though the division of responsibility says nothing about what and how much we eat, we know when children are raised with this approach and when we as adults have eating competence that we naturally just do better in self-regulating in general. But something that I often get asked about this approach is how do we raise children who actually are healthier eaters long term when in the short term it seems that they actually eat worse? As we will continue to dive into throughout the upcoming weeks of the Academy, you'll see that sometimes when you use the division of responsibility versus, say, an authoritarian approach that would maybe dictate if, whether, and how many bites of a given food or vegetable your child might need to eat at a meal, with the division of responsibility, sometimes parents object, saying that it looks like their child's eating poorly when given the chance to refuse or reject foods like vegetables. They may do that. But the reason that we want to look at this is because in creating competent eaters, we see a few overarching things that happen when this approach is used, again, repeatedly and over a long period of time. The Ellen Satter Institute has studied eating competence in quite a few different research studies, and they've found overall that people who have eating competence have better diets, they're more joyful and positive towards eating, they're more trusting and capable with themselves and other people. They tend to have the same or lower BMIs, relating to whether they're more overweight or obese. They tend to have better physical self-acceptance, they tend to be more active, sleep longer, have better medical profiles, fewer health complications, and in general do better with feeding their children. All of these long-term outcomes, I think, are things that all of us could say that is ideally and ultimately what we want for our children. Oftentimes in the here and now, it's easy to get stuck on the day in, day out role of feeding. It's easy to look at a meal and measure its success by was it eaten or not. But if we can take a step back, if we can evaluate our anxieties and insecurities in the feeding relationship, if we can own some of the stressors that are a part of life and find better, more productive ways to handle them, we can begin to see how we can establish a division of responsibility in our family, and ultimately how we can help promote eating competence not only in our children but also in ourselves as adults. And this can be key. This can transform not only your own relationship with food but also your children's and your families as a whole moving forward. So a lot of you may be realizing that at the core of a lot of your anxieties is your own lack of eating competence, and that's something that I think many adults avoid addressing, and at some point, hopefully, come to realizing is a key factor in how they approach feeding with their kids. If you're unsure where your eating competence lies, or if you just have a general sense of feeling insecure with your own body image or ability to self-regulate and overall relationship with food, I would highly encourage you to evaluate where your eating competence is. Again, there is no shame and no judgment in this. This is truly just a task of self-reflection that can help shape your food parenting approaches moving forward. By addressing things like, do you feel good about food and about eating? Is it something that makes you feel good, or does it bring about feelings of guilt or shame? Do you tend to be someone who eats a variety of food and learns to like new foods, or are you someone who eats rather restricted diets? Do you tend to trust yourself to eat enough about food, or do you worry with doubt and shame over eating too much, or struggle on the other end of disordered eating with not eating enough and fueling your body properly? Do you even take time to eat? Is this something that is even a value that you place on your day-to-day life, or is this something that you struggle with? We can see with each of these different areas of eating competence, just briefly mentioned here from some questions that the Ellen Satter Institute provides, that we can begin to see how some of these areas of eating competence that may or may not be satisfied within our own lives begin to shape our anxieties and begin to shape our negative, maladaptive food parenting approaches with our children. The Ellen Satter Institute has an excellent tool that's been validated in the research to help us better identify eating competence. Another more common topic in the eating and health wellness world right now is intuitive eating. And the two align and parallel very similarly with the overall promotion of eating competence skills. But from sticking to the Ellen Satter Institute and the information I've been sharing here, there is a validated tool that you can use to begin understanding a bit more about your own eating competence, and that is a quiz that I will also be linking in this week's module. You're encouraged to check out the Ellen Satter Institute in more detail. I'll be linking it in the resources for this week, as well as different intuitive eating books and resources that are also available on the subject to help you better understand how your own relationship with food and your own food and feeding approaches as a person impact those that you use as an adult. In addressing eating competence, it's okay and even important to be honest about the conflict that we face with needing to nourish our children and yet not wanting to miss opportunities to build eating competence in ourselves or in our children. As I've said before, we have several eating opportunities a week where we need to decide how are we going to feed our kids. It doesn't just boil down to what we feed them, because all of us know if it was that simple, we would not be here together in the academy. Instead, we need to begin evaluating what is that approach that we're going to begin moving forward with to build eating competence long-term, but also to create sustainable, sane strategies that we can use on the day-to-day basis in the multiple eating opportunities that we have each and every day. One of the ways that we can begin to work through this is to evaluate our own parent feeding styles by comparing how our feeding practices and approaches align or they don't align with the division of responsibility. We can begin to better align with what we know we need to do moving forward in order to build that eating competence and create a division of responsibility with our own family. Here are some guided questions that come out of another excellent resource titled Anxious Eaters, Anxious Mealtimes, which is a recent publication that offers other great ideas in terms of how to offer foods in a way that demote anxiety and promote successful mealtimes. By considering, do you or your child currently decide what is offered, when food is offered, and where food is offered? In your house, is food currently being offered and rather presented in a way that's allowed for acceptance or rejection? Or is your food currently being demanded, in which you call for or require your child to eat a specified amount? Is there currently a negative or a positive tilt going on at mealtimes? And again, that language comes out of Anxious Eaters, Anxious Mealtimes, but the negative or positive tilt is something that often parents hopefully learn when their children are infant, and that is your child leaning in to eat and to initiate and to show engagement, or is your child pushing away and having a negative tilt that tilts them away from the food that they're most likely being pressured or demanded into eating? With some of these simple questions and some of the things we've talked about in the last few slides, we can begin to see in a big picture how our food parenting approaches are aligning with the division of responsibility or not. So let's take a look at what the division of responsibility does look like at each age and feeding stage. A question that commonly comes up within the academy, especially from families who have younger children, most often in families with children under the age of 2, is at what age can we start even using the division of responsibility? I think there's an overarching sentiment with parents that at a younger age, children are just so vulnerable. And typically when they're less communicative, such as under age 2, we tend to believe our children won't understand the structure and limits that we're setting for them in the feeding relationship. Because of this, we tend to think that they're quote unquote too young to use this type of structure or love with limits with the division of responsibility. And so we begin to wait to establish a division of responsibility until later in childhood, more towards age 3, where we can recognize that our child likely understands more of what we're saying. However, I encourage you to take a step back and think of all the things that we do from a very early age in order to start reinforcing rhythms and routines and proper age-appropriate expectations. There are behaviors that we encourage early on. There's language that we use even when we know it's over our child's head, and that we repeat early and often so it begins to become a part of their own script in their own life as they get older. We use rhythms and repetitions to create routine that provides security from our children from a very young age. And the same is true with feeding. We know that the division of responsibility is the gold standard best practice approach from infancy on. While it does adapt and shift a little bit with different ages and stages, we can see how this looks with different aged children and how it begins to shift throughout childhood to, again, continually promote eating competence as a child ages. When a child is an infant, the parent is responsible for what is being offered, whether that be breast milk or formula. That decision lies on the parent. The parent also aims to create a calm and organized feeding environment where bottles initially or the breast are offered. We also see how parents adjust the environment to accommodate to an infant's cues and timing and tempo, their appetite, the amount of feeds, all of that with the when and where also come into play in infancy. In infancy, a child is ultimately responsible for if, whether, and how much they choose to eat. We can tell when a child as early as an infant has an appetite and is eager for their food. We also begin to see some of their cues, as mentioned a couple slides ago, with the negative tilt of when a child begins to push away or turn their head or give us a negative response that shows us they're no longer interested or no longer have an appetite for the food that's being offered. We can trace back as early as these experiences as a parent to begin to think, was that difficult for us to let our child dictate if, whether, and how much to eat? Particularly if you have some of those anxieties that play into the worry cycle that we talked about, you may be able to trace back as early as infancy to see that even back then, it was a struggle for you to stop feeding your child when they began to show you that in their job of the division of responsibility, they were satisfied and they were done. And this is a very key thing for us as parents to recognize, because the division of responsibility helps promote self-regulation from infancy on. And that is a skill that children, most typically developing children, I should say, have from birth until it becomes broken. And if we begin to override their ability to self-regulate and we begin to undermine their ability to know what their unique needs are, we begin to interrupt their ability to innately understand their hunger, their fullness, where satiety is, where an appropriate level of fullness is for what their body uniquely needs to grow and develop appropriately. As solids are introduced and an infant becomes a toddler, we as the parent continue to be responsible for what, when, and where food is offered. We decide what foods and in what order new table foods or new textures are introduced. We decide when those foods are and try and begin to add in meals and snacks accordingly around when our child sleeps and is awake. We also deem safe locations for a child to eat. We decide what high chair, and if they're at the table, we decide the safe environments that we feel are appropriate for our child at a young feeding age and stage in toddlerhood of where they get to eat. We also know that toddlers begin to get to be responsible for whether or not they eat and how much they eat. This just looks a little different when it is of food rather than just, say, fluid milk from the breast or a bottle. Toddlers are also excellent self-regulators if we allow them to be, but usually around this stage, when we begin to see their independence and autonomy peaking, we as parents begin to maladapt our own responsibilities of what, when, and where food is offered. We begin to try and override what their role is in terms of how much and if, whether they eat. And that's where we begin to move away from the division of responsibility, even though it is completely age appropriate for a toddler to be raised within this type of feeding environment. As a toddler becomes a child and later into adolescence, this continues to be maintained until the child leaves the home. A parent is responsible for what, when, and where, and the child is responsible for if, whether, and how much they eat. There's a lot more information, especially from different books and resources that are out there that I'll link on the resource pages, about what this conceptually looks like in older children and adolescents. But right now, based off most of the ages of people in this group, it's important for you to realize that if your child is still within the home and under the age of 18 and still considered a child, you can still consider that the division of responsibility is appropriate for their age. You can begin to delegate some of the responsibilities as a child, say gets into adolescence. But ultimately, something that's important for families to recognize is even with multiple ages of kids within the home, you can use this approach and this structure for your entire family. That should minimize the amount of stress you have in terms of coming up with what, when, and where food is offered. Because even though with multiple children and multiple different life stages, your schedule can be chaotic, feeding doesn't have to be one more major stressor, because you see that you can use a uniformed, universal approach that helps each of your children and your family as a whole. Alternatively, I know an impetus for many families to join the Academy is because a new infant sibling might be coming into the mix, and you begin to see some of the tendencies that, say, your toddler or child has in feeding that maybe were more sustainable when there wasn't an infant in the home and you were able to cater to them more. But with a new baby in the picture, you begin to see how some of these bad behaviors that you've been allowing with an older sibling could begin to have repercussions on a younger child. This is a Very, very classic situation, and often the motivation for parents to begin to evaluate it. And so that's why we'll also talk about how the division of responsibility is an appropriate approach no matter where you're starting. As I've mentioned, it's ideal that you start in infancy because that gives you the opportunity to set this foundation up from the get-go. But oftentimes for families, that's not realistic. Parents didn't know better, and so they weren't doing any better than what they already knew. So if your child is already a toddler or already into childhood or even into adolescence, you can always begin to shift to this approach, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Another way the division of responsibility is helpful with families is when it comes to feeding children who come in different shapes and sizes. A common question I get is, but my child is so small, how will this approach work for them? We assume and have these limiting beliefs and underlying anxieties that if our child is smaller and we don't pressure them to eat, they will not eat enough for their unique body types. We've had many, many families in the academy who have had children who are small on the growth curve or around or under the 10th percentile. They may have been born at the 10th percentile and always stayed a child who is a little bit more petite. Alternately, we also might have had families, and you might have a child specifically who is born closer to the 90th percentile and always remained a little bit larger than other kids their age, from infancy through toddlerhood and into whatever age they're at now. Both of these scenarios are okay. Our goal is never to measure a child's worth based off of the 50th percentile. That is where 50% of the children lie. That is not the intended goal for your unique child. If your child was born at the 10th percentile and has always remained on the growth curve around the 10th percentile, chances are your child's unique body shape and size is intended to be more petite and at the 10th percentile. That does not indicate more or less worth than a child who is born closer to the 90th percentile and who has always trended on the higher percentile of their growth curve. Both of these children could be growing perfectly and appropriately for their age. However, it is extremely important, particularly if you have a child of a different size than another child in your family, for you and your spouse to begin evaluating where your underlying anxieties and attitudes are towards body weight, shape, and size. As we talked about with eating competence, this also comes into evaluating body image and where you and your spouse as parents believe weight plays into worth. This can unexplainably shape the way you as a parent food parent your child. If you are trying to get your lean child to eat more or your larger child to eat less. And with the division of responsibility, you can feed both children the same. We will talk about this a little bit more specifically in the upcoming slides, but right now I want to help you go ahead and identify if growth is actually a concern or if it's more a perceived concern. As we talked about at the very beginning with the worry cycle of, is this a founded health or medical condition or issue, or is this an unfounded and more perceived problem by you as the parent, which more comes into it based off your own perception of body weight or intake or how the two correlate. So if you're wondering if the division of responsibility is appropriate for your child, it is. It is indicated for a child who is small on the growth curve, large on the growth curve, or who is needing help getting back on their growth curve. It can be indicated for each of those children, but it can be helpful for you as the parent to better understand which of those children might be your own. So if you look at the pink growth curve on the left, you can see that trends are low on the growth curve, but they're consistent with the pattern and with the overall growth percentile trend based off of age. If your child's growth curve looks similar to this, again, regardless of whether it's at the 10th percentile, the 50th, the 95th, any of these percentile trends can indicate that your child is growing appropriately for their own body type. They have stayed consistently along their curve, and unless there is some other reason that you have concern for your child's overall feeding situation, or you've had to have a feeding evaluation done that has indicated that there is another problem at hand, based off growth charts alone, we can see that currently your child is sustaining enough intake based off what they're eating to sustain appropriate growth. This might mean that a small child is a large eater. This also could be that a bigger child is a small eater. Again, if you allow your child to self-regulate, they will naturally self-regulate for how much their unique body needs for their unique size. Conversely, if you go to your child's pediatrician and you ask for their growth curve and you see something like what we see on the right, above is height, and that is thankfully still following along the curve. But if you look below at weight, you can begin to see that there's a plateau present. This is ideally not what we want to see and often indicates that you need to be speaking with your pediatrician further or potentially go in for a feeding evaluation or a little bit more medical evaluation to see what is happening and what happened when the growth started to fall off the trend. You can see this child started closer to the 50th percentile, but was unable to continue to grow on trend for their certain age. When this kind of thing happens, it doesn't mean that the division of responsibility is not helpful or not appropriate. And yet something like this can often be that founded medical event or feeding problem that created the worry cycle to begin with. Rather, what we need to be doing as parents is to evaluate what was happening when their growth percentile no longer followed on trend. And if we can begin to trace back and have a medical evaluation and work with a medical team to begin understanding what deficits were occurring, whether it be physiological or feeding related, so that our child was not able to sustain appropriate growth based off how much they were eating, we can begin to address the underlying issues that are at play. Many families feel worry and concern that even if their child has been growing properly and been following along their growth curve, it is because the tactics that the parent has been using in order to quote unquote get food into their child. Again, going back to the anxieties that we've reviewed again and again now, parents' automatic worry cycle over their child not eating enough can quickly derail their efforts in order to adopt the division of responsibility. So if this is a concern to you, you might be worried about if your child will lose weight once the division of responsibility is adopted. And while different sources cite that that may happen initially when the initial transition happens and your child might begin to eat less for a few days or weeks until the mealtime anxiety begins to lessen on their end, you need to know that this is normal and that their body will begin to self-regulate and learn how to adapt to the new mealtime environment and structure that you're putting in place with the division of responsibility so that they're able to compensate and follow back along their growth curve. You should not be seeing a dip in the growth curve because the division of responsibility is being used. While there might be an initial dip for a week or two, you wouldn't expect to see this long term. Instead, as you begin to see that they're more comfortable in their role and in controlling if, whether, and how much they eat, and you begin to take ownership and leadership in what your role is to decide what, when, and where food is offered, you'll begin to see that your child's internal hunger and fullness cues will be able to sustain appropriate weight. Some of the techniques that you can use in order to transition a child, if this is a concern for you, are listed here. With maintaining your role, reassuring your child that they don't have to eat, so they again and again continue to understand what they have control over in the feeding relationship with the new feeding dynamic at hand. You also can remind your child that there will always be something available that they like. Again, we'll talk again about this a lot more in the upcoming weeks, but that can be a helpful reminder for your child as well. Also including higher calorie foods for them to eat in order to help promote that weight maintenance. You don't want to be pushing these, and we want to be discontinuing any of those food parenting practices that were doing so before, but you'll know that your child is eating enough for their unique body weight and size if you continue to monitor their growth curve when they go to well child visits. You don't necessarily need to go into weight checks unless there's another medically indicated reason, but if you can continue to see that your child plots on their growth curve appropriately for what their usual body size is, you'll know that they're doing an appropriate job self-regulating. Alternatively, parents can also feel anxious towards letting a child have freedom to eat as much food as they want of the foods given. And while we'll go into much greater detail on this as we handle week 5 when we talk about Love It Foods, the key thing to begin to understand right now and to identify is those underlying anxieties or beliefs that you have towards your child's size and their ability to self-regulate or handle whatever appetite that they have. A large appetite on a child with a smaller frame rarely compels us as parents to restrict their intake. However, we know that when a child tends to be higher on the growth curve, we're more predisposed often to limit what they eat. We tend to project our own insecurities about food and body weight or trusting ourselves to self-regulate around Love It Foods on our children, and this can create a very slippery slope. This worry cycle can predispose children to just as much disordered eating as the slide before this, where we're concerned that a small child may not eat enough. We can create a lot of other problems if our child, we are concerned, eats too much. If in your family you have a history of restricting your child and how much they can eat, it may take some time for trust to be rebuilt in the feeding relationship, just as it does for a smaller child who is wondering if you're going to force them to eat. Similarly, a larger child with a larger appetite needs to know that you trust them to control how much they eat and how much their body needs to grow appropriately. At first, they may eat more and they could potentially gain a little bit of weight. Just as we talked about on the previous slide, a child may initially lose a small amount of weight. However, with consistency and repetition and more trust and control in the feeding relationship being established, a child will begin to thrive within these basic principles of eating competence to begin to trust their own body to self-regulate and have the discipline and permission to know how much to eat and when to stop when they're appropriately full. This again reiterates the point of how the division of responsibility can be very helpful in families with children of different sizes. I counsel tons and tons of families who have a smaller child with a smaller appetite and a larger child with a larger appetite. And the best piece of feeding advice that you can take away from today with this is to feed your child as if you weren't concerned about their weight. If they're smaller or if they're larger, you can slightly change some of the tactics that you're using a little bit, as you'll see between the last slide and this slide, but ultimately you see they're rather the same. The angle at which you come at them from might differ slightly, but you should see that the attitude and the overall approach that you're using with the division of responsibility and promoting self-regulation in a child of any size remains the same. You're going to want to continue to maintain your role with what, when, and where food is offered. You're going to want to continue to reassure your child that they may eat as much as they want, that you won't be restricting the amount that's available, unless, of course, it just isn't available to have more. You also want to let your child know not only that there will always be something that they like available, but you also want to reassure your child and let them know that there will be enough and that they don't necessarily need to binge on what's available because it's not going to be limited. You want to continue to include high-calorie foods and not restrict these, but rather just make them a normal part of life so they become less coveted foods. And again, just as with a smaller child, you want to continue to monitor their growth curve at well checks to make sure that they're following their curve. Again, I do not recommend a scale. I do not recommend daily, weekly, or even monthly weighing unless there's another medically indicated reason to do so. Rather, I would just encourage you to continue to keep an eye on your child's growth curve over time as they're already being seen by a doctor, just to make sure and to reassure you as the parent that they are doing an excellent job at self-regulating, as most typically developing children will do. As we wrap up, I want to just address a few hiccups that I know tend to happen in a lot of different families. For some of you, I recognize that you might be joining the Academy as a single parent. Others of you might have signed up without your spouse even knowing that you're enrolled in the Academy. Others of you may have spouses who are more involved and do a lot of the grocery shopping or cooking. And some of you may have spouses who are completely disinvolved and don't do any of the meal planning or grocery shopping. However, whoever is involved in the picture of feeding your child, whether this be a partner by marriage or an ex-spouse who also has partial custody of your child and is partially feeding your child, it can be helpful to recognize a few steps that you can have as a feeding team. Just as it's important to understand your own anxieties and insecurities and attitudes towards how you approach feeding, it is very important to also, as best as you can, approach feeding as a team effort with whomever else feeds your child. If this is a grandparent, a nanny, a spouse, an ex-spouse, whoever it might be, this is an important time for you to begin to take all the information that we've talked about and begin to come up with an approach that is going to work for your family as a whole, even if it's not a conventional structure of a family. In order to do this, you can begin to recognize some of the differences and how they can be good and potentially balance one another out in the feeding relationship for your child when they're used appropriately. You can also begin to have conversations about where your own anxieties and insecurities lie, where your own attitudes and approaches are coming from, and begin to come up with a collaborative approach. In this week's module, I shared several different conversation starters to help you begin having this conversation with your spouse and to probe some different perspectives that you both might have and why they might not necessarily always align, but rather at times be in conflict. Also for you to address what the limiting beliefs that you have are so that you begin to understand what some of those offhand approaches might be rather than more intentional approaches for your feeding relationship moving forward with your child. Additionally, if you are one of the parents who feels that you're very alone on this, whether it's because you actually are a single parent or because because your spouse just isn't on board with this, you need to know that you can still take the lead and still be successful. Lastly, I want you to begin to recognize that it is natural for you to learn and grow. You are not expected to be able to address the higher needs on a hierarchy of needs, as Ellen Satter shares here in one of her books called The Secrets of Feeding a Healthy Family. We wouldn't expect you to start at the top of the pyramid. Instead, it's important that you understand that achieving eating competence is going to take time. Your family's growth and change throughout this process is going to at times be a struggle and is at times going to be met with a lot of success. But for you to begin to recognize where you come at feeding from right now and where your family's eating competence is, either for you as an individual and or with your spouse and or for your child and your family as a whole, will help you to understand where is a realistic place for you to begin setting about this adventure. Similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to recognize that as each need is satisfied in feeding our child, we can become more aware and more able to address the next level up. This model demonstrates how building a foundation for feeding can help us to work based off what we are doing now and what's working with what we're doing now to ensure that our children's nutritional and developmental needs for enough food are met and that we continue to progress up the structure towards more competent eating over time. The key here is that we're realistic about our standards and our expectations, not only of ourselves as parents, but very importantly also of our children.